In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. In this interview, I sit down with Dr. Jacquelyn Campbell. She is an expert in the field of domestic violence. She's authored or co-authored hundreds of publications and multiple books on violence. She was an original contributor to the Violence Against Women Act, and she is a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. This was such a great interview and conversation. We did have some technical difficulties in the beginning, so the audio quality might not be the best, but I hope you will still take the time to listen to our conversation, and I really hope to have her back on the podcast in the future. Dr. Jacquelyn Campbell, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I am fine.
Perfect. And you just got back from Thailand. How was that trip to Thailand?
It was amazing. It was a conference. It's of the group called the Nursing Network on Violence Against Women International. And we've been in existence now 30-some years.
Wow.
It's a small group of nurses, international, that have been working on issues of violence against women all of this time. And we've, purposefully stayed small so we all know each other really well. And it was a wonderful conference. I gave the keynote address, which was a wonderful honor. And then I also did a couple of other presentations and listened to amazing presentations from people all around the world, from nurses who are doing this work. And anyway, it was just very rejuvenating,
Yes.
In terms of, you realize again that you're not alone in this, and that there's many other people, smart people, caring people, that are working on this, and that, together we can help make the lives and the health of women experiencing violence a little bit better.
Absolutely.
Through research and nursing practice. The other cool thing is there's so many more PhD students, recent PhD grads who are taking it up. So for someone that's been in the field for a long time, I feel like there's good people going to take over.
Absolutely. And so you've specialized primarily in domestic violence homicide, is that correct?
The way I describe my area is the physical and mental health effects of intimate partner violence. And the worst health effect, the worst physical health effect is homicide, is death. And it could also be from suicide. So that is where there's many other people who have done other research on other physical health effects besides me. So we have a real accumulation of knowledge there. And I am perhaps best known for the work I've done in terms of what are the risk factors for a violent relationship escalating to a homicide.
Yes. And is that in reference to the danger assessment tool which you created? Yes. I was looking at that, and it's such a great tool, and it's available to anyone, right? You can just go online and really look at it. So I think that's really fascinating. Can you talk about that tool and how it was created?
Well, the first study I did related to domestic violence was my master's thesis. It was way back. The publication from that was way back in 1981. And that's when I first came to the realization from my own study and then reading everything I could get my hands on, that when women are murdered in this country, they are most often murdered by a husband, boyfriend, or ex. And for instance, that they are 9 times more likely to be murdered by a husband, boyfriend, or ex than they are by a stranger.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, in the ether, for most women, they think that if they would ever get murdered, it would be a stranger in the night. That's not who's most likely to kill them. So I decided if I was going to address this precursor of homicide that I needed to work with abused women. And that was back when domestic violence shelters were first starting. So and part of academic nursing, I was teaching at Wayne State University in Detroit at the time. And part of academic nursing is that you do some service component, but that's part of your role. And so I decided to volunteer at the local domestic violence shelter. And that way I could get to know abused women and understand more about their lives, their realities. And I did my dissertation research on domestic violence and the women's responses to being abused, and both physical and behavioral responses. And so I was talking to a lot of abused women, and when I would talk to them and they would tell me their story, that's one of the things, tell me a little bit more about your situation. They would oftentimes say things that made me really worried about their safety, whether or not they were living in a potentially homicidal abuse situation. And I've always, when I got to know women who were experiencing violence from a partner, I was amazed at how strong and smart and resourceful they were. Nothing like what was sometimes portrayed in the literature as someone that was beaten down and, not realizing they're being abused or unable to escape from the situation. It was much more that they were trying to problem solve around this issue, and both he usually and she knew they had a problem, and he was, trying to change his behavior. He just didn't have the tools to do it. There's usually children. So, even if she decided to leave him, he's still the father of her children. She doesn't want him to go to jail. How does that help in the long run? Their realities were such that sometimes they were in a very dangerous situation and didn't see it. The analogy I make is, those of us that have long drives, long commutes, when you get in the car in the morning, you don't think, well, there's a statistically, there's a measurable chance that I'll be in an automobile accident and I won't live through it. You just don't think about that. You put it in the back of your mind. And so as I was using my own research, reading everything I could about homicide, I came up with this list of what I thought were, red flags of that this abusive situation was highly dangerous. And at that point, I had 15 items, and I took them to support group. I was leading support group at the shelter at the time, and I took them there. I showed them to the women, and I said, how would I ask about that? Like, one of the things is if you're forced into sex, sexually assaulted by an abusive partner, which some women are. The majority of abused women are not physically forced into sex. They experience hitting, pushing, shoving kinds of things, but not that. So, but I asked the woman, how should I ask about that? Should I say, have you ever been raped by your partner? And they said, no, that's not how we think about it, because it's your husband, it's your boyfriend, and he doesn't do it every time we have sex. And so that's when we came up with the wording forced sex. So the wording on the danger assessment is women's. They told me how to say it. Same with this strangulation item. They said, what I think about is choking. That's how I describe it. And technically, the word choking means when you have food stuck in your throat. But women don't say, yes, he strangles me, or don't describe it that way. They say, he chokes me. And that actually, chokeholds are one way that women experience this choking. This is an aside, but I find it ironic that even though now police officers are no longer taught to use chokeholds because it's so potentially lethal, that you can go to a mixed martial arts class and learn how to kill somebody by choking, by chokeholds. Anyway, that's just an aside. I always think that's, shouldn't be allowed. But anyway, so it's women's words in the danger assessment. And then, like the choking one, actually, that was not on my original list. And one of my brilliant master's students, I've worked with many, many, many students have taught me so much. She went with me to a support group. She said, why don't we ask the women if there's something else that scares them, that makes them think that their partner might kill them? And that's when they told me about the choking line. That wasn't on my original list. So then I did some preliminary work with this list of risk factors. I discovered that in working with women that they were really bad estimating if the abuse was increasing in severity or frequency. So that's when I developed the calendar that's up at the top of the danger assessment. And again, with women, and I'm in the healthcare system, and people oftentimes, various conditions, patients are asked to fill out a calendar, when their symptoms appear, when how this happens. And I thought, well, we could use this calendar approach. And so, again, I tested it with the women in support group. They were wonderful to be my partners in all of this. And, we came up with this calendar approach, and it was very useful for helping women see for themselves if it was increasing in severity or frequency. I mean, one of the things we know about adult learners, that it's much better for any adult to see for themselves rather than be taught, this is true, that's true, that's true. But, let you discover it for yourself, and it sticks in your brain. So that was one of the things you're tempted to say, well, is it increasing in severity and frequency? And she's like, I don't know. It only happens every once in a while. And then you feel like saying, oh, are you sure? Which is not the way to partner with women. That's what I'll say, is that the danger assessment is an assessment. It's to be done with abused women and for them. It is for them to see for themselves if there's a high risk of homicide. And, so I always, when I train people to use it, I say, this is not a tick box kind of an exercise. This is not an instrument in the sense of the usual research instrument. This is an assessment to be done with women. Mm-hmm. And so we came up with those, as I said, there's 15 and then 16 items somewhere with the choking strangulation one. And then when I did the study to determine how much these risk factors should be weighted, because yes, it's a risk factor, but should you count 4 points or 2 points or 1 point? You need to do research to determine what that weighting should be. So then we did the study. It's called Risk Factors for Femicide, and it was funded through the original Violence Against Women Act funding that had research in it. What we did was a case control study. We compared women who were abused with a random sample survey in 11 cities with the women who had been murdered in those same cities. When research is rigorous, it has a control group aspect, and you can't obviously randomly assign women, abused women, to get murdered or not. So you can't do it that way. The way you would do a randomized control trial for a medication, like, for instance. So instead, you need to do this case control, which is you can look backwards and see what are the differences between women who are abused but never have been killed or almost killed, and women who are actually murdered. The other really strong feature of that study was we not only went to the police homicide files in those 11 cities to see what was known about cases when a woman was murdered, but we also asked a loved one of the woman who was murdered what were the other things that were happening in that relationship before she was killed. For instance, one of the risk factors was an assessed of you. So did he ever beat you when you were pregnant? In other words, actually hit you when you were pregnant. And here's how it's actually worded. I had to look at it myself. You'd think I'd have these memorized. But anyway, have you ever been beaten by him while you were pregnant? So tense matters, so there's an ever there. But unless she was pregnant when she was murdered, that's something that happens before, and it could happen long before the actual homicide. It is the hallmark of a dangerous abuser, one of the red flags. But there's no way you could get that unless you talk to somebody, her mom, a sister, a best friend, brothers. Sometimes we talk to find out what had been happening before the homicide occurred. What are those red flags that you can help women identify that are the hallmark of a homicidal abuser? And so when we did that larger study, we also added a few other things and changed a few things. Like we had originally, there was, is he violent toward your children? Well, the trouble with that item is that you have to warn women, okay, there's this one item that if you say yes to, we're going to have to report to Child Protective Services, right? If he's being violent toward the children. And, this is kind of like, I told you these are risk factors for you being killed in the relationship. And and there's this other one, though, that, is going to trigger a report to Child Protective Services. And that didn't seem fair. It's kind of like a bait and switch or, kind of thing that you would have to, before you ask that question, you'd have to warn her if she said yes, that you're going to have to report it to CPS. And then you're like, yes. So then, she's probably going to say no, even if it's a yes. Mm-hmm. So we changed that one to, does he threaten to harm the children? Which does not trigger a report to CPS, but, does suggest that he's potentially violent toward the children. And we also, even though we found it was not particularly predictive, interestingly enough, we added, do you believe he is capable of killing you? Abused women are really good at assessing the risk of him hitting her again, but they're not as good about this risk of homicide. That's why, you do the danger assessment. But sometimes you will get a woman that says, oh, yes, he is absolutely capable of killing me, and this is how I know. And so that needs to be on there, too. So, those were the decisions we made, what the data said, and what were the differences between cases and controls. Like the stalking one, interestingly enough, does not make a big difference between cases and control because so many abused women are stalked that it doesn't, there's not a big differentiation between women who are being abused and women who are killed. They both were being stalked by that abuser. So, and I had a brilliant statistician that helped me with this, and we figured out what the weighting should be, and that's the algorithm, we call it, in terms of how you score the danger assessment. You can do it without the weighted scoring. Is just more accurate if you do and you get actual levels of danger versus, the more yes answers, the more danger there is.
In your research, is there any sort of way to intervene and get help for the man to prevent the man from becoming abusive?
Yeah. Well, and then one of the things we do is on each of these items that she says yes on, we do some safety planning. So we talk to her about what has she thought about in terms of, safety planning, like around the gun, getting it stored safely at least. Definitely, what women want is for him to change. And unfortunately, in this country, what we have done and we call it better intervention programs or offender intervention programs. And they have been developed. They're all over the country, and they tend to be court mandated. Now, that comes from, I think, what is an old idea that, a lot of what we think we know about domestic violence was developed in the 1990s. And Ellen Pence, who has since passed on, was a brilliant theorist and developed a lot of programs in Duluth, Minnesota. And so it's oftentimes called the Duluth model. She's the one that developed the power and control wheel. And the sort of old, I think it's old now, saying that the root cause of domestic violence is power and control comes from Ellen's thinking. And like I say, she was brilliant, but that was the 90s. I think we know more now than we did about, where violence comes from. And so the notion was that abusers were motivated by trying to control their partners. And even when I did my dissertation and talked to women and did a 3 points in time prospective study with women, and a lot of the women, and just under half of the women that were in my dissertation were Black. They would say, he didn't control. Are you kidding me? I wouldn't let him control me. They really would resist that kind of conceptualization. He hits me. He needs to stop that. But, this controlling business, and I show him the power and control wheel. They're like, what are you talking about? And so I used to think, well, most of the women that Ellen worked with were white. Maybe it's, just, a cultural kind of a difference, and but I've kept on to that thought, and I do have a controlling item on the danger assessment. It's the highly controlling item. I also pay attention to the NISVIS, which is the CDC survey, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which is a random sample survey of both men and women. And on that, they ask about controlling behavior. And as many men as women say, my partner does these controlling tactics. So I'm like, if we hinge this whole thing on controlling behavior, I think we may be missing the boat. And going back to your question about the better intervention programs, were based on the premise that this guy wants to control his partner, and that's why he hits her, and that he doesn't want to change, so that the only way he would go to an intervention program is if he was court mandated, if he was forced to go. And then in this program, we will help him realize that his motivation is controlling his partner, and that, that's against the law, and, that he needs to stop this behavior. And the premise was, once he realizes, it's all about power and control, maybe we can help him be that way. And so that's the court-mandated batterer intervention programs. And like I say, they're all over the country. Are, what we have used as the major program for helping abusers not abuse, or making them not abuse. Mm-hmm. And those programs have been RCT tested, and otherwise randomized clinical trial tested, and they do not work. They do not significantly reduce the use of violence against the partners. And we pour a whole lot of money into those programs. In fact, usually the abuser has to pay for them, which is, a lot of times these guys are struggling to make a living. Unemployment is a big issue. So, it is a problem. And in order to be into this court-mandated program, he has to be arrested for domestic violence in order for the court to put him into this program. And many women are not at all interested in a partner being arrested, especially if he's Black or he already has a record. How does that help her situation? So there's an intervention program called Strength at Home, which was developed in the VA. Casey Taft is the person, and you can Google it. It's www. Strength at Home. It's been RCT tested, shown to work. Both reduces the use of violence and reduces PTSD. So that's a whole different idea that violence stems from, and there's a lot of brain science that supports this, someone having PTSD. Now, the PTSD that was assumed to be in the military was from combat exposure, but oftentimes that PTSD, started when someone was a child. And we've had research for decades showing that the number one risk factor for a person growing up to be violent toward their partner is witnessing domestic violence at home and or being abused themselves. And so, an intervention that reduces the PTSD as well as reducing the use of violence can be and has shown to be effective. And so Casey has developed a civilian version of Strength at Home. And first of all, if you were using violence against your partner and you wanted to stop, wouldn't you rather go to a program that was called Strength at Home than one that's called Better Intervention Program? It's far less demonizing, doesn't require an arrest. In the veteran population, people go to it voluntarily. They don't have to be court ordered to go to it. They're very happy to go to it voluntarily. And so, Casey, and I'm his biggest supporter, is, like I said, has developed a civilian version. They're right now in a multi-site randomized clinical trial of that program. And it doesn't say, oh, you poor guy, woman, you're being violent toward your partner because you have PTSD. It doesn't use it as an excuse, but it just helps people understand what's going on in their brain, why they, quote unquote, lose their temper. And when they do brain scans now, it really does look like somebody losing their temper. One of the things that happens is if you have PTSD and you're triggered, if you're, either by a memory of the traumatic event or by, someone getting in your face and yelling is one of the things that can trigger you. The frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that makes decisions about whether or not to hit somebody, whether or not to what I say is jump into bed with somebody if you're attracted to them. Mm-hmm. That part of the brain goes silent when you have PTSD. That's one of the hallmarks. And, you've experienced this trauma. And so there's very little, the brain is very hypervigilant. It's ready for bad things to happen to it. The organism, that's one of the things that happens in the brain. And so you get somebody that really does lose their temper. And one of the hallmarks of the old time better intervention programs is they tell the abusers there's no such thing as losing your temper. And they say, you're just trying to control her. That's what it's all about. That's just an excuse, that losing the temper. Well, the 2024 brain science suggests there is such a thing. And, if you've been raised in nurturing environments like I was, I've not had any great traumas in my life, thank goodness. My prefrontal cortex goes straight into, would not be a good idea, even though this person is really making you mad. It's not a good idea to hit them.
Yeah.
And that's what brains raised in nurturing environments do. But when you've been raised, where you see your father hit your mother hit your father, you've been abused yourself, you've been exposed to a lot of violence, your brain acts differently, and there is such a thing as losing your temper. So anyway, long story short, that's what women want, is they want an intervention for him that he can afford to go to, not, a nice course of therapy, which could be helpful also, that you can't afford, like individual therapy, but something that's affordable. And that's the other beauty of Strength at Home. It could be, and as it is in the VA, a behavioral health intervention that Medicaid could pay for. So it also could be affordable.
Wow. I've never heard of that program before, but I'm definitely going to have to go and look that up. Yeah. And I mean, and that makes total sense. All of the reasons why you wouldn't want someone to go to the court mandated one. And I interned at the public defender's office after getting my master's, and a lot of the cases we had were domestic violence related. It was always, more often than not, the victim in that case would be there trying to, not have them go forward with charges. And with a lot of the women as well, mostly women, they are relying on their partner for financial support and for support with their, yeah. So, it doesn't help them really at all to have their partner now be in jail. So,
right.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, I think we just need a different paradigm, to think about this. And rather than saying the root cause of domestic violence is power and control, to say, the root causes of domestic violence are complex.
Absolutely. Yes.
And it's not just one thing. And there needs to be complex interventions. I mean, like one of the things I will say, in our study, we found demographically that the murderers were the least well educated of all the groups. So one of the things is that, abusers need to get a GED. That needs to be provided for them. And they were the least likely to have a job. And again, so therefore, one of the interventions we should be doing is to help, and actually place abusers into a job. So that way, he can hold up his head. And the more times he gets arrested, the less able he is to get a job, right? Mm-hmm. And, and part of it is, if you don't have a job, then you have way too much time on your hands to worry about whether or not your wife is flirting with somebody, which seems like so, honestly. But, that is part of the issue, and he can't hold up his head, and so, it's just, and I'm not saying that's an excuse for hitting somebody. It's never an excuse, but it's part of the picture.
Yeah, 100%. Going back and talking about the Violence Against Women Act. So just a few months ago, you were at the White House celebrating the 30th anniversary of this act being signed into law. That's incredible. I was reading some of President Biden's remarks, and he mentioned how this act was one of his proudest legislative accomplishments in all of the years he has served in the government, and that it broke the dam of congressional and cultural resistance and brought this hidden epidemic out of the shadows. Can you talk about what societal attitudes were like towards domestic violence before this legislation?
Yeah, well, one of the I was a mere puppy at the time, and I was very unimportant in the whole thing, but I did work on it. I used to go down to D.C. and we worked in this, well, I remember, I don't know where it was, but in some big cavernous room without windows, without a view or whatever. Anyway, and I remember one of the things Biden would say is, this has to be a crime bill. It's the only way it will get passed is if we make it a crime bill. Because there was a lot of us that were a little worried about, putting this all in the Department of Justice, that it was a health problem too, that there was mental health issues, et cetera. But that's what he always said. I can get this passed if it's a crime bill. And that made all the difference in the world, because before then, if there was a call for police to come because there was violence going on in a home, they would just have the guy walk around the block and cool down, And this way they could at least, if there was, clear signs that it was a he that hit she, they could actually arrest the abuser and, make sure that the abuser knew it was against the law and can't do that. And that was incredibly important, especially for the, serious abusers, the potentially dangerous ones. And, there are abusers that the only way to address their issues is through the criminal justice system. It's too late for a strength at home intervention. But, my take is, let's not wait till it gets that bad. Women don't call the police the first time they ever got hit. Mm-hmm. It's usually gone on a lot before they're scared enough to call the police. So it was amazing, and it made all the difference in terms of the police response. Women started to realize that they could get a response from the police, which before they couldn't. That was incredibly important, and it just sent a message to society that this is not okay, because it used to be, that it was for some people, at least, it was considered okay for an abuser, for somebody to hit their wife.
You talk about contributing to that legislation from a nursing science lens. Can you explain how that differs from maybe what other advocates were incorporating into the bill?
The big thing there was, like, if a woman was injured in that abusive context, she might end up in the healthcare system. So in our emergency departments, for instance, from a nursing standpoint, it's important for her to feel like she can tell healthcare professionals, yes, this broken arm is from my husband doing it to me versus, oh, I fell, and because there's a lot of stigma with being abused, et cetera. So that was an incredibly important part of my work, was to help the healthcare system see that abused women were amongst us. And from that early intervention standpoint, strength at home, I think, can be used early before the abuse gets really bad and, has increased to the point that it's really dangerous. The same within the healthcare system. If we can help women feel like they can disclose to us as healthcare professionals, nurses, physicians, but it's mostly nurses that are on the front line here. And that if we can help people who are experiencing violence from a partner disclose to us, that we can help get them the help they need. And it should be them that says, this is what I want, not us that say, let us get you an order of protection. And again, an order of protection can be enormously helpful, but it is a criminal justice act. And, like I say many times, women don't want to involve the criminal justice system.
100%. Well, I don't want to keep you from your other meetings. Yeah. I know you're probably so busy, but anytime you want to come back on, I am here and would love to keep chatting. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time.
Okay. Email me and we can figure out another time.
Yeah, absolutely.
To continue.
Definitely.
Okay?
Thank you so much.
All right. It was good to talk to you.
Yes, absolutely.
You're a good interviewer.
Oh, gosh. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Becca.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself. If you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, there's no better place to begin than with Buzzsprout. It's the platform I use, and it makes publishing, promoting, and tracking your episodes so easy, even if you're not tech savvy. Plus, they help you get listed in all the major directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And here's the best part. When you sign up for a paid Buzzsprout plan using my affiliate link, you'll get $20 off, and you'll be supporting the show at the same time. Just head to the description of this episode to find the affiliate link. Now, let's get back to the episode.